Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's Substack Live with me, Dave Keating from the Gulfstream Blues Substack. And
I'm Julien from the French Dispatch. Happy to have everybody here with us again today.
yes, we're double teaming you Franco-American relationship style again with our take on the very alarming developments that have happened recently across the Atlantic. Of course, we want to give you the European perspective on how these things are being viewed in Brussels, in France, in the UK, but also we're going to have a reaction to Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European Union address last week. I think we were both, we both thought there was a bit of hypocrisy in that speech. I think it's fair to say. So we'll get into that a bit. And we will close out with an update on European-Israel relations, which are moving extremely fast. I mean, we really were going from a situation for months where nothing was moving, where all of a sudden everything's moving very fast. So let's start out with the royal visit, the unprecedented second state visit that took place by Donald Trump to London this week. This was, of course, promised to him by Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, when he had that, frankly, groveling visit to the White House back in February, where he just seemed desperate to try to get on Trump's good side. And of course, a royal invitation was a very cheap, easy way to do that. But the timing of this was difficult for Starmer, because Labour has just sacked their ambassador to the US, Peter Mandelson, because of his involvement with Jeffrey Epstein. So it begs the question, if you can't be next to a British man, a British gay man, by the way, who was caught up in the Epstein affair, why can you be standing next to Donald Trump, who is actually much more complicit, evidently, based on the records and the photographs, than Peter Mandelson ever was? So there was that question. But of course, there's also the fact that this visit happened in the midst of the crackdown after the Charlie Kirk assassination last week, which has really seen this incredibly fast and ambitious crackdown, an effort to silence the political opposition in the US. And you even had the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel, the late night American host, for making a joke about President Trump, and MAGA's knee-jerk reaction to try to politicize the assassination. He was pulled off air right in the middle of this visit, and Trump had to address it during the press conference. Overall, I would say this visit was pretty demoralizing for people on the left in Europe, in particular, for people on the left in the UK. I mean, the sight of Keir Starmer yet again groveling to Donald Trump, the sight of all the British institutions groveling to Donald Trump. I mean, I was thinking, if somebody had given Donald Trump a cloak before his visit to the UK and said, here you are, here's some invisible clothing, they're beautiful, wear them to the UK, and Donald Trump was walking around Windsor Palace butt naked, I think that everybody in the UK, the royals and the politicians alike, would have complimented him on how beautiful his invisible clothes were. It was really, really hard to watch the groveling. What did you make of that visit?
I mean, the visit was a weird one because it's come at a really, really problematic time where you've basically got Donald Trump and his acolytes attacking everybody, deplatforming everybody who disagrees with their politics, basically attacking the opposition with made-up laws. I mean, I think you saw that they declared Antifa, which is a very decentralized grouping of groups,
Yeah,
as
not even
some
a group,
kind
really.
of no, not even,
Yeah.
and basically rendering them a terrorist organization, which opens the floodgates to attacking anybody they disagree with as being the far left. And we saw how Donald Trump reacted to Kirk's murder. But I mean, it was a really weird visit, purely because even the wins, even the things that do benefit the UK to some extent, were received extremely poorly. So, I mean, we have this tech prosperity deal where they announced £150 billion or $203 billion in tech investments to beef up the British AI and tech infrastructure. The problem with that being, first of all, that it's repackaging old promises that happened under Biden, so it's not really matters. But one thing that was really important for me was that you saw Nick Clegg, who's quite prevalence amongst British people in the US and who was the former head of public affairs for Meta, I think it was.
Yeah.
He basically just went on stage in Cambridge at an event and said, "Oh, we're just vassals." And even the fact that you've got this massive investment coming in is being viewed as a horrible thing, because to be quite honest with everybody listening and everybody who cares about this kind of topic, nobody really views a relationship with the US or Donald Trump as positive anymore. And, this is sort of even ignoring all of the Epstein list stuff where, it's almost certain that Donald Trump is on there in some way, shape, or form. And his friends in the FBI and the CIA who he placed there are covering for him. It's not even the fact that Donald Trump is actively working with Vladimir Putin, undermining Western unity, undermining the defense of Europe, undermining every positive policy position that has existed for about 100 years now. It's the fact that you can't trust him.
Yeah.
It's the fact that he comes and he basically makes everybody look like poodles. He makes everybody look like fools. And this is why, again, people are being really aggressive towards, Starmer about this, because, okay, this is a
And
very...
deservedly so. I mean, the thing is, what are they getting in return? I think that's the fundamental question here. After all of this groveling for the past 6 months, they're still in a situation where, I mean, this royal visit got wall-to-wall coverage, also on my own network, on continental European networks. Why? Because everyone wanted to see if Trump would suddenly flip out on Keir Starmer or King Charles or whoever. So this clearly hasn't bought any stability, or else people wouldn't have been watching this so closely. And on that tech pact that you mentioned, yeah, you're right that this is a lot of repackaged investment. But as I wrote on Substack earlier this week, and I'll link to that down below, there's really worrying elements of this tech pact that it basically locks the UK in to American tech dominance. So here in the EU, where at least there's talk of trying to lessen America's tech dominance over Europe and to try to bring data flows over to Europe to keep them in Europe, this essentially says that the US and big American tech will be running the UK's digital infrastructure forever, in perpetuity. And the other really worrying thing about this tech pact is, even though it's not explicitly said in the text of this pact, which I think is 3 pages, it is very clear that there is a quid pro quo going on here, that in exchange for this investment from American big tech companies, some of which was happening anyway, investment that they would be likely to make anyway, given the market dynamics, the UK is going to rewrite its tech laws. That's very clear.
Yep.
Keir Starmer has signaled that he is willing to do that. And the US government, at the behest of the American big tech companies, has been demanding that of the UK and the EU. They don't like the new limits that have been passed on social media companies, on tech ownership, and they're trying to get both the UK and the US to end those laws. I'm almost certain now that the UK will be doing that very quickly. The question now is whether the EU will follow suit. There was one quote in a Politico article this week, which was very worrying. It was from a White House source who said that the strategy here is to basically co-opt the UK, get the UK to cancel their tech regulations, and then use the UK to lobby the EU to end their tech regulations. I mean, basically, just blatantly making the UK a vassal arm of the United States to do its bidding in Europe.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, that was the whole reason why Donald Trump supported Brexit in the first place. And this is a natural result of Brexit. If you have a country that is completely isolated, that was previously a part of a large bloc that was able to fight back. And again, I'll get to a comparison in a second on the different reactions to this kind of initiative. This is the simple result of conservatives in the UK and the far left being aggressively against membership of the European Union. This has led to the UK being weak. And I mean, there's this thing here so I saw a comparison where someone was saying, well, why is the UK in this position and why is, France not in this position, or why is Germany not in this position? And while the easy answer behind that is the EU, there's one other specific thing where there is more of a privatization culture in the UK than in other countries. I mean, in France, for example, the state usually will maintain a majority stake in the majority of the major important infrastructures or companies, right? And this is something that never developed in the UK. So the UK is a lot more at risk from this kind of hijacking from foreign states, especially outside of protective infrastructure like the EU, than other states, even accepting the fact that many of these states who have to fight against this kind of initiative are from are in the EU. And this is even considering the fact that, in my opinion, there are some laws that need to be revised in some extent, either to be made more harsh or to be made slightly softer. But there's no excuse for giving away your sovereignty, either technologically or legally, to the United States. I mean, they can't hurt you that badly. And I think lots of diplomats and ambassadors have forgotten that the US, I mean, the economy is about to go into a massive recession. The US cannot hurt other countries as severely as many are worried that the US can.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point. You say that people are saying, well, the UK has to make the surrender, but the EU doesn't.
Yeah.
But the EU might is the thing here. And then the argument for Brexit is perfectly valid, because if the EU doesn't protect its citizens against foreign powers, what's the point? Maybe we can segue here into Ursula von der Leyen's State of the Union speech. I mean, I would say that
Our
with the
favorite topic.
UK, our favorite topic, I would say that with the UK, basically because of their foreign policy orientation, under both Labour and Conservative governments, they really have no choice. They could dramatically reorient their foreign policy orientation, but they have no choice right now but to do whatever the US says. It's not surprising. It wasn't surprising in May when Keir Starmer signed his surrender deal with the United States. That was basically assumed that was going to happen, because what they're trying to do here so desperately is they desperately need Donald Trump to repeat this special relationship thing, a term I can tell you that no one in the US ever uses. When I was working in Washington as a reporter, I never heard, most Americans would never know what that phrase means, but it's so desperately important to British people. So they have to give him this ride in the golden carriage and do all this buttering up just to have him say, I love the special relationship. And he even said that the bond between the US and the UK is, quote, unbreakable, which, you think 10 years ago, that would have been very reassuring, and it still seems to be reassuring to the British political establishment. But how does the British public feel about that? About the US president who's, developing an authoritarian regime in the United States, who's making threats against Europe, against Denmark for military invasion, against the UK and the EU for trade, that he's saying that his hold over the UK is unbreakable. Is that a good thing? The British establishment thinks that it is, but I don't think citizens right now looking at what's going on in the UK think that it is a good thing that the US would have an unbreakable hold over the UK. And yet that's where they've put themselves. But yeah.
I mean, there's one thing on this that people always forget, is that there is a certain aspect of diplomatic activity and niceties that have to be put in place. So, we're not going to see this Love Actually situation where Prime Minister Hugh Grant calls the US president a troglodyte or whatever, right? They're just going to kind of suck it up and just say, okay, whatever, cool. But I mean, there's something very interesting where, despite the fact that you have lots of far-right British people in the UK and also here in Brussels who are like, yes, we need to be closer to Trump, we need to be friends with Trump. The last poll I saw showed that something like 92% of British people do not like Donald Trump.
Yes, yep.
And this is the simple
and even
reality.
70% of conservative voters.
Yeah, and the fact is that they're going to play the diplomatic game. They're going to let him wind himself up, talk shit, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is that Donald Trump doesn't have this unbreakable hold. It's just simple, like even the special relationship nonsense. Even under Obama was very pro-British, and even he was like, look, you guys need to get over this nonsense, because the special relationship thing was I think it was coined in the 40s.
Yeah. After World War II.
Yeah, so World War II thing. And to be honest, we've gone so far past that in international development and international law and just in general, that I don't think I would almost qualify almost every single diplomatic relationship as being some kind of special relationship. Because at this stage in globalization, the relationships are so close and intertwined that unless you completely lose your mind, it's not going to break.
The hold doesn't have to be unbreakable, but it is unbreakable if the UK enters into that kind of vassal relationship. Yeah. I mean, it's unbreakable if the UK assents to making it unbreakable, and that's what they're doing right now. And so to contrast this with the EU, I'm not all that convinced that this isn't the same position that France and Germany are in, because they are kowtowing just as much as Keir Starmer to Donald Trump. I mean, in my view, Macron and Merz's visits to Washington were only marginally less supplicant, only marginally less humiliating than Keir Starmer's visit. And that's where the real problem is, because there is absolutely no reason for the EU to be doing that. It is a larger single market than the United States. On
Yeah.
purchasing power parity, it has an equal GDP to the United States. The UK, yes, okay, post Brexit, they don't really have much of a choice. The EU does have a choice, and yet they're choosing the same surrender that the UK is. And then you're left to ask, well, what's the point of the European Union, right?
So there was a game that was being played on the US in the French and German relationships and the visits to the US. And a big part of that is it was different to how Starmer did it, even though I was critical of the way that they behaved, purely because they pushed back against Trump quite a lot. I mean, I remember there was this famous thing where I'll find a video of it somewhere and post it on Twitter or something.
I
But I
think I know you're
remember,
going to list the Macron comment, right?
yeah, where Macron kind of like held Donald Trump's hand, put it back on his thigh and said, well, actually, the reality is, no, 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 no. And I think a big part of that was and continues to be that they're still trying to not only rein in the worst impulses of the US when it comes to Israel and Palestine, because the US position on that has become absolutely insane. But on top of that, they're still trying to make sure that the US support for Ukraine persists. Because despite the fact that the Europeans are still the biggest funder and supporter of Ukraine collectively, and I think it's several hundred million more than the US, right? They still know that they still need the US to be there because, Donald Trump can spin his wheels with his Putin relationship. He can keep making these discussions happen despite the fact that they are not going to go anywhere. But even then, it's still a case of trying to keep that in play, even though I think we're both very critical of von der Leyen's behavior towards Donald Trump, even if she's potentially behaving as a sacrificial lamb.
Well, yeah, let's talk about her orientation toward Donald Trump because, we've criticized her greatly for the surrender deal in late July, for surrendering so readily to Donald Trump's trade war, for signing off these tributary payments to the US, 750 billion euros in energy investments, 800 billion euros in general economy investments. I mean, it's basically how the Roman Empire would treat its vassal states demanding tribute. But the fact is that she was acting on surrender instructions from the EU leaders, national leaders, from President Macron, from Merz. Macron initially was saying that you should be tough and be ready to retaliate with the trade mechanism. But at that summit in June, just before the surrender deal in July, he relented. He could see that he didn't have enough support within
Yeah.
the European Council to lead a robust response. So what irritated me in Ursula von der Leyen's State of the European Union speech last week is,
Just one
she
thing.
came in, yeah,
No,
is
just one thing.
what thing? Well, I'd say the main thing was she came out at the beginning of the speech saying, sounding very bold, sounding almost
Yeah.
revolutionary. Europe needs an independence, a revolution. We all must have courage. But she didn't have the courage in that speech to name specifically who she's talking about when she's talking about a new era of global power politics, when she's talking about Europe being faced with adversaries around it. She would only talk about Russia. And this is starting to get very annoying, I think, for European citizens, because we're told that, Russia is so horrible, and, it is, I'm not disputing that. But, we're told, look at what Putin is doing to his domestic opposition. Look at Putin's domestic policies. Now look what he's doing, all the threats he's making. And of course, look at the invasion of Ukraine. But don't look at what the United States is doing. Don't
Yeah.
look at what Donald Trump is doing domestically. We're not going to talk about that. I mean, it is complete hypocrisy. And for Ursula von der Leyen to stand there in front of the parliament and say that we should all show courage and demand independence a month after having just completely supplicated herself before Donald Trump and surrendered all of our tax money in these tributary payments, and accepting a 15% base tariff that basically destroys the World Trade Organization. After a summer of surrender, for her to get up there and say that, I mean, it was ridiculous. And several of the leaders pointed that out. Aracha Garcia, the head of the center-left S&D group, said, this is ridiculous coming from you. Valerie Hayev from the Macron's Renew group also said something similar. So it was hard to take. I mean, I'm all for this type of rhetoric, but it's not being backed up by action. We're having all of our leaders right now say Europe needs to be independent, Europe must be sovereign, blah blah blah. But they're
Mm.
behaving in the exact opposite way. And so I am tired of all of these empty words when they're just going to finish that speech talking about how much Europe needs to be independent and have courage. They get done with that speech, they pick up the phone to Washington, and what can we do for you? We'll do whatever you say. I'm tired of this, right?
Oh, I get it. And I mean, I'm in the same position. I mean, to be fair, as a federalist, seeing Eritrea and seeing Valerie saying the things they said made me very happy because it was very much pushing back in the right direction, right? And there's this really weird thing where, for example, I mean, I remember I posted yesterday this news article from the before World War II, where exactly what happened to Jimmy Kimmel happened to
Yep.
these similar comedians in Nazi Germany, right? And the fact that we're seeing Trump behaving the way Putin did when he was taking control of state apparatus and media apparatus in Russia in the early 2000s, the fact that we're not pushing back on that, the fact that people are still being reliant on this kind of situation. And I should say that there's been many of us who have been pushing for European independence and strategic autonomy and everything for, I think, decades now. You had Macron when he came in, did his whole Sorbonne speech in 2017. You had all of the Gaullist shenanigans throughout the last 100 years, we'll say, to be honest. And the fact that we keep hearing this weird rhetoric from von der Leyen, who's not a strong commission president, and who every single time she engages in some kind of speech reminds people why she shouldn't have been commission president, is, I agree, extremely fucking annoying. Because, I mean, I'm one of these people who was screaming, we should have Mario Draghi. But then proved us all right who was saying this when he released his Draghi report, which was then mostly ignored. And I mean, I think just to take one quick look at the State of the Union speech that von der Leyen gave not too long ago, lots of what she's announced is repackaging of things that we have heard announced over the last 3 or 4 years. Like the Climate Adaptation Plan is just a Green Deal in a new name. The Media Protection Act, media action that we've heard since 2020 actually. The Single Market Roadmap to 2028 is just a repackaging of the integration of capital markets in the system. I think the only new thing that we hadn't actually seen a concrete proposal for was a 28th regime. Because
Yeah.
everything else is something that we've either seen in the commission or that has been announced previously and just never made it off the desk of some desk jockey in the commission because they weren't allowed to do it because it wasn't politically salient enough for von der Leyen or whichever commissioner was trying to make a play at whatever position, right? And I think this speaks to the biggest issue again, and we keep coming back to this again and again, and especially talking about Ursula von der Leyen again and again, that we keep hearing these speeches, particularly from German politicians, I'll say, and I have a lot of beef with German politicians about strategic autonomy. We need to be brave. We need to be independent. When we see no bravery whatsoever, we see no big move to independence. I mean, there was a weapons package recently where I think, was it Poland or Germany, who they started repurchasing American weaponry, right? Despite the fact that despite the fact that you've got Denmark who are now purchasing European anti-missile defense systems because they realize you can't trust the US. And we keep coming back to the same bad actors and the same bad faith behavior and the same shitty rhetoric that doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
ignores the
it's the lack of a sense of urgency, right? I mean,
yeah.
it's Ursula von der Leyen is sitting there reading words that sound very urgent. If you were looking at her, the text of her speech, you'd be like, "This is an urgent situation," but she doesn't seem like it's urgent. No one's reacting like it's urgent. I think that basically Europeans have not woken up yet to what the
No.
United States is becoming. And I don't know what it's going to take to make them wake up. It was interesting. A couple of weeks ago in late August, I did a video interview with James Kerr Lindsay, who's a professor of international conflict, does YouTube explainers of international conflicts. And in the course, it was about EU-US relations. It was very long. But at some point in the interview, I was lamenting that Europeans still tell me that they dream of living in the United States. And, they're just most average people on this continent. have no idea how serious the situation is in the US. And I
Yeah.
said kind of offhand, this is a country that is hurtling toward civil war. I mean, it is on that trajectory. It's not there yet, but that is where things feel like they're going over there. And then I read
Yeah.
the comments after the video, and people were freaking out about the fact that I said that. Oh, I can't take this guy seriously anymore after he says the
Yeah,
US
of
would go to
course.
civil war. That could never happen. How absurd. And I was just curious. I was thinking, okay, where are these people from that are so offended? I mean, there were a lot of positive comments as well,
Yeah.
agreeing with me. But then I looked and they were all European and they were mostly British. And I
Oh,
thought,
of course.
anyone living in the US probably wouldn't react with such incredulity to the idea that there is a very real risk of civil conflict. And of course, the assassination, which came just a couple of days after that video was published, that really laid bare how serious the situation is. But who's
Yeah.
least likely to accept that? Europeans, British people in particular. When I talk to my friends and family in the US, they are very, very aware the risk of the situation spiraling out of control over there. Europeans, they are vassal states of the United States. They depend on that country for their military protection, for the structure that underpins this entire economy, the subject of my book, which is coming out in November. And yet there is no sense of urgency because it's like their minds cannot accept what their eyes and ears can see and hear, that the US is on this very, very rapid trajectory toward chaos. And that has huge implications for Europe, which depends on the United States. The logical urgent thing to do in that situation would be to rapidly de-risk Europe's relationship with the United States. And yet no elected politician on this continent, other than Pedro Sanchez, is suggesting doing that.
I mean, Macron's been saying that for a very long time. Let's not forget.
Yeah,
But
but he's not acting. I mean, Pedro Sanchez is actually throwing things out there, like his support
yeah,
for an
sure.
EU army or the coordination of EU armies. Macron, I mean, it's not his fault. Yes,
No,
he's
no.
been saying this for a long time, but he's a lame duck now. I mean, he has no
Oh,
purchase.
it's not even his lame duck. It's just that whenever France proposes this, everybody freaks out about French domination of the
Yeah,
EU, right?
yeah.
But I mean, particularly the profile of the people that you're mentioning now, we know exactly who it is. It's weird far-right libertarians who really like Donald Trump and who will deep throat him day and night just because they think he's based and super cool, right? I have the same thing with like the US situation where you have pretty much everybody who is sensible and who has a burn on their shoulders saying that shit is hitting the fan pretty quickly. I mean, within not even an hour of Charlie Kirk being assassinated, you had Donald Trump blaming the left. You had his far-right acolytes screaming about civil war. You had them basically trying to paint the shooter and his family and friends as everything but, who they are now
And also
turning out to be.
as part of a wider movement, as if there's this,
Exactly.
as if basically as the Democratic Party organized this, as if this is an
Yeah.
organized leftist terrorist plot. When of course all the evidence, we have very little evidence right now, but the evidence is
No.
this was a lone wolf type act.
Yeah, and particularly someone who comes from a very distinct subculture of weird far-right wingers who grew up on 4chan. But I mean, the fact that these people constantly, rather than say, maybe we need to calm down and turn down the rhetoric, and instead they try to blame the trans Illuminati who are trying to kill all white people or some nonsense. It shows that there's no real way forward at this time to actually find a solution to the conflict, right?
And
this
did
is turning
anyone have
into...
any doubt that they were going to react that way? I
No,
mean,
of course
anyone
not.
in Europe was surprised by the way Donald Trump reacted or about how MAGA reacted. And the minute that headline came, I have to confess, I had no idea who Charlie Kirk was before this. Maybe it's my
Oh,
age. I
you have all of my
vaguely
envy.
heard of, yeah. It sounds like I'm better off for not knowing. But, when that came through, I said, well, who's this? And I looked it up and I said, oh, shit. Here
Yeah.
we go. This is it. I mean, it was going to be something. If it wasn't this assassination, it was going to be something that kicked this up because they have been champing at the bits to launch this crackdown and they were going to use any excuse. And this is what happened to come. And if it doesn't happen with this, it'll happen with the next thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Europeans need to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's important to also point out that when this has and there's studies now that show that this, shootings are far and away perpetrated by the far right, that a lot of these organizations that actually get involved in this kind of shit are from the far right, etc., etc. The White House actually took down a report stating this from the White House website.
Yeah, yeah.
And on top of this, it's really important to note that all of the things that we're seeing today, all of the things that are being said right now, all of the behavior that we're seeing from the far right today and the cloud clutching and everything, they didn't do this at all when Melissa Hortman was shot and she's a
Right.
Democratic lawmaker.
Trump didn't even
This
recognize the name when he was asked about it.
exactly. This didn't happen when anybody who was perceived as left wing was shot. This didn't happen when any other school shootings happened. All that those people got were either mocked or thoughts in prayers. I mean, Nancy Pelosi's husband was attacked with a hammer, and then people basically made fun of him and created Halloween costumes. And Charlie Kirk himself said that the guy was a hero who should be bailed out.
Yeah.
Right. And like, you have to see, and like, as someone who studied political communications for years, who has worked on the topic and everything, there's a very disturbing pattern that we're seeing in the US that's being imported into Europe, particularly through a lot of British weirdos here in Brussels and elsewhere, where basically the minute something bad happens, no, it's actually not their fault. No, it's not their problem, blah, blah, blah. No, this isn't true. No, this didn't happen. Actually, the problem is Muslims, Arabs, immigration, etc., etc. This is something that whoever's listening to this right now should probably be very wary of and should keep this in mind when they listen to news reports and how people react to this kind of shooting and crisis and tragedy.
Yeah. Before we go, let's also talk about another element of that State of the Union speech, which was this announcement on Israel. I do think that was a material change. I think you're right that most of that speech was repackaged stuff, except for that 28 member state. I'd love to talk about that another time. That's a whole other topic. But the announcement that the Commission would act unilaterally to freeze bilateral fund from the EU executive that basically bypassed the council, where this issue has been blocked by the countries that are supporting Israel no matter what. It seems Germany, Austria, Italy, Hungary, and Czechia. So then we had these other two proposals, which is to sanction the two far-right ministers in Netanyahu's cabinet. That needs unanimity in the council, so that's not going anywhere. But we also have this proposal to suspend part of the EU-Israel Association Agreement. It's basically a downgrading of the trade relation. So it would take a privileged trade access to a normal trade access, but it would affect a huge amount of investment, basically 37% of the EU-Israel trade. It would be pretty big, and that only needs majority support in the council. So that can pass. But I think that the bigger picture is von der Leyen is so solidly in support of Israel. You know, she flew there immediately after the October 7th attacks. She is German to her core. And we know that Germans have a particular mindset on this topic. The fact that she has come around means that things are really, really moving in Europe quite fast.
Yeah.
You know, I wrote a Substack earlier today actually about Eurovision and how like 5 member countries in Eurovision have now said they will not participate. They're pulling out of the contest if Israel is in it next year. That's a move. None of them, not a single country was willing to say that until now, actually willing to make that threat. And so things are moving in Europe. I think the question is how fast they're going to move. And that's what's a little unclear to me. I mean, as we're having this full-scale invasion of Gaza happening right now before our eyes, is this going to continue the rapid pace of movement, or is this a blip and then you think we're going to go back to entrenched positions?
So I'm in two minds because, to be honest, I have a possibility as a possibility, to be honest. I mean, it could just be a blip and it goes back to things quite quickly because they may realize that Netanyahu and his extremist government aren't going to change anything. But it could become a more long-term thing. I mean, we know that Macron and several other member states have been pushing quite aggressively now. There was the vote in the UN to recognize Palestine, which was successful, if I'm not wrong. And I mean, there's a very basic, very human aspect to this whole situation right now is that whether people believe that, you know, Israel shouldn't have reacted to the attack, which I think is nonsense, or you justified it because Israel has a right to self-defense, you get to a point where the death and destruction is no longer justified. I mean, we've hit a stage now where you've just got entire cities being leveled. You have Netanyahu and his ministers drawing up colonization plans for Palestinian territories. You've got people aggressively trying to kill the entire peace process and the
Yeah, you've got
two-state
Israel
solution.
bombing the peace negotiators while
Yeah,
they're
it's
in
ridiculous.
Qatar. I mean, you also have Israel
And
bombing five different countries in the Middle East. I mean, this is a government out of control, right? And
yeah, of course.
I think
But it's
that's why
extremists.
things changed. Yeah, I mean, the things changed because things just got so beyond the pale in terms of what
Yeah.
the Netanyahu government is doing. But how much influence does Europe have here?
I think
I'm not sure. I mean,
I think quite
on
a
this
lot.
economic question, the EU is Israel's biggest trading partner. I mean,
Yeah.
everyone always says, "Oh, the EU is totally powerless because they don't have the diplomatic heft," but they have the economic heft. If the EU suspended all trade with Israel, Israel would be in real trouble, and
Yeah.
there would be a big question about whether the US would come bail them out.
Yeah. And there's this thing that people forget is that, to be fair, one of the most influential actors in the current situation when it comes to the two-state solution is actually the Europeans, because Hillary Clinton got the idea from the Europeans in the first place, which she then took to the UN and tried to push through various channels, right? And the EU is okay. So right now we're not the most influential, because if you have the US and the Trump saying we'll support Netanyahu to the hilt, there's not lots many people can do, because the US and the Trump is just as liable to start bombing Palestine as Israel is right now, right? Because I mean, foreign policy in the US right now is completely insane. But we need to remember that the the EU, sorry, it can seem quite slow and it can seem like it's plodding along. But if the suspension of trade related provisions comes into effect after a council vote, then the EU will start looking at other sanctions after that point. Not only that, but the extreme ministers of Israeli government are going to get hit, just like Hamas and the violent settlers are going to be. The fact that the EU, I think, is the only entity right now that is actually targeting the settlers. And I think this is a very important thing as well, because the settlers are some of the perpetrators of the worst violence that we're seeing actually right now in Palestinian territories. I mean, we've seen the videos of them just walking into people's houses, dragging out women and children, shooting them, rolling their bodies down a hill, and then moving on, right? Like, this kind of stuff because it's not even just a government level action at this stage. Like, there's certain aspects of Israeli society who think this is entirely justified. And someone has to tackle this at the same time as they're tackling the government, because nobody else is. And I think this comes down to the big issue that we're having today in society, where we're not holding everybody to account in the same way we should be, right? Like, we don't tackle far-right activists on social media or far-left activists on social media or in political life the same way we tackle Nigel Farage, Trump, or Netanyahu, which is a problem, because these people get used to being able to behave with impunity. And then when they behave with impunity for long enough, then they just keep going and spinning and rolling, and just, it's a snowball effect. And I think that we're going in the right direction, probably a bit too slow, at least for my liking, but something has to be done to get things back on track and to stop this complete spiraling out of control in Israel and Palestine, because otherwise it's never going to stop.
Yeah. I guess what will really be key here is, I think, Italy, because I don't
Yeah.
see Germany moving. So I think, and the other countries, Austria, Hungary, and Czechia, are not big enough, I think, to make a numerical difference, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be mistaken about that. It's Italy. And what's
Mm.
interesting is you had Antonio Tajani use the word genocide in a speech earlier this week.
Which was very surprising.
Very conservative
Yeah.
foreign minister of Italy. Now, it was in the context of defending Italy. He was saying, we have nothing to do with the genocide that's happening there. So it was kind of like in passing. And it's not really clear whether he meant to say that, but this has happened several times with right-wing politicians in Italy's government. So I wonder, I mean, politically, if the Meloni government is making some calculations here that this unabashed support for Israel, no matter what, is not really
Yeah.
politically tenable domestically anymore. That's going to be something interesting to watch.
And
I guess we'll know more next week.
yeah, and it's really important for people to actually note that Tajani he was pretty close to Berlusconi, like very,
Right.
very close. And that's
Former
quite
European
telling.
commissioner. So.
Yeah, and this is just telling of how far the dial has actually moved on the topic, and just how extreme the situation has gotten, because it's European conservatives don't like speaking out against Israel, because again, they feel a certain weight from history and the weight of what happened in the past, right? And it's very telling that you're getting more and more conservatives, and we're now starting to slowly expect that, oh, maybe Meloni will switch and start defending Palestinians and Gaza's right to exist a bit more than she has to date, which is very surprising because people get too used to far-right conservatives being aggressively, and I mean very, very aggressively pro-Israel, to the point that, several have said that the Palestinians deserve it, that they shouldn't have a right to anything, blah, 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 right? And
They're
it's
not real people and so on.
exactly, and it's awful. It's awful stuff. And the fact that we're seeing movement is a great thing, quite honestly.
Yeah. Well, we'll see what happens. I think we'll have to leave it there. I've got to run to speak on a panel. But this is going to be a very interesting area to watch next week. We should do another live once things maybe get more settled in that area. But yeah, in general, alarming times. And I think we all need to do what we can to make Europeans wake up to the
Yeah.
danger that they face from the West.
Be nice to each other. Everything's
Also
fucked up.
that.
Just be nice to each other. Like this, we don't need this shit. It's like, come on, guys. But
Yes, I
yeah,
agree.
thanks for listening, guys. And see
Everybody
you
have a
soon.
great weekend. Yep. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.
Ciao, guys.